is we're going to, I guess everyone's introduced themselves. We're going to talk a little bit about the different types of case study, because what I have found is that one of the biggest challenges I have when talking about case studies is making sure that everyone understands the different types and how they fit together. We'll have a brief session about structuring and writing a case. I have another handout here. We'll have a break for lunch. Then I'll talk a little bit about using cases in the classroom and online. And then finally, I'll walk through some of the cybersecurity cases that we've already produced and talk about them in the context of the NIST cybersecurity framework. As I mentioned at the very beginning, all of the materials that you will see projected, plus a whole bunch of additional materials, can be accessed through these web links on the, and you've got them on the piece of paper in front of you. And you're also welcome to share that information with any of your colleagues. Everything I produce is open access, so the videos, the papers, the book informing with the case method, they're all open access, so you can feel completely comfortable sharing them. With that, I guess we will move on to the first topic. Let me just, oh yeah, here we go. We'll close this one down. We'll open up PowerPoint, and we'll see if, let's see, I think I want to do a parallel duplicate slideshow. Okay. They told me that I might be able to advance the slides with this. This is the cover of Informing with the Case Method. That book is available for download as a PDF on the website. Ooh, it does work. Cool. So what I'm going to do is start talking about the different types of cases, and I'll briefly go over the distinction between research cases and teaching cases, and then I will, within the context of teaching cases, talk about discussion cases. And then we'll have an exercise where I'll give you some potential topics, and you have to decide whether they would make for a good discussion case or would need to be modified if we wanted to make them a discussion case. So to begin with, virtually all research cases are structured so that they tell a story about cause and effect. So when you write a traditional research paper, especially in the social sciences, very often you'll use surveys to look at lots and lots of different things, and then you can do statistical analysis to determine if responses are significant. You might do mathematical analysis to walk through these, to walk through a problem and demonstrate its logical conclusion. You might do in-depth interviews. A lot of the normal research that we do tends to be based around getting enough numbers so that we can make an argument that our research is generalizable. Research case studies are different. Research case studies tell a story, and then they will try to relate that story to theory. That can be used either to create new theory, to provide a counterexample to existing theory, or to provide an example that supports theory. Sometimes we will have a multiple case design, and in a multiple case design, we will contrast two different cases or three different cases to show a number of possible things. One of my earliest pieces of research involved doing case studies of two different companies in extremely different industries. One manufactured cookies and sold them. The other was one of the first examples of automated trading. And what was interesting about the two cases was, despite the fact that the industries were entirely different, the pattern of evolution of the two companies was almost identical. And so what I try to do in the cases is parse out those elements of similarity that might have accounted for the similar evolution. Now, sometimes what you'll also do is you'll look at a couple of cases that look very, very similar, yet have very, very different outcomes. In that case, what we're trying to do is figure out what tiny differences would necessarily produce such different outcomes. Later, I'll use the example of a recipe. If you bake a cake according to the recipe, hopefully it'll come out the way it was expected. If you bake that cake but leave out that half a teaspoon of baking powder, you end up with construction material. Now, nobody thinks that the cake is a great cake because of the baking powder, but if you leave it out, you have serious problems. So sometimes very small differences can lead to very large changes in outcome, and that's a source of complexity. And it's almost impossible for me to talk about anything without mentioning complexity. Sometimes you'll get a large enough set of cases so that you can actually do some statistical analysis as well as qualitative analysis. The pair of papers that I did that gave me job security in the end looked at a collection of 97 expert systems that had been developed in the 1980s, in the mid-1980s, and I looked at them in 1991 to try to understand what happened to them. And I was able to gather information on 81 of those 97 systems. I did extensive phone interviews, and what I found was that there were certain characteristics which were much, much more likely to be associated with systems that were still in use than they were with systems that had failed. And so, as a consequence, I used that information to make an argument about things that we should think about when we're trying to design expert systems. The characteristics of research cases. Since you're usually dealing with very small numbers, it's hard to argue that research cases will generalize. But there are certain things that doing a research case gives you that you can't do with other types of research, like survey research. And one of these is triangulation. You can use multiple sources of data. In a case study, I am happy to use interviews, archival documents. I could do a survey within the organization. I could basically create all these different sources of data, acquire all this data, and then merge them together into a narrative that makes sense. You can't do that with other types of research. You can also use multiple forms of analysis. You might do some statistical analysis of data within an organization. You might do a textual analysis. You might do conceptual analysis. You can look at multiple theories. That's another form of triangulation. One of the most famous case studies ever written was Graham Allison's The Essence of Decision, which looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what it did is it took 3 different models that were used in the social sciences, and it tried to ask the question, which of these models better fit the facts as they occurred in the Cuban Missile Crisis? And you can also have multiple investigators. So you can actually have multiple people looking at the same information. All of this allows you to get a much, much richer picture of a small observation as opposed to a much less rich picture of a lot of observations that you could do statistical analysis on. Research cases tend to have a very strong tie into theory. You can explore new theory, you can confirm theory, you can provide counterexamples. And in the social sciences, your research cases tend to be published in the same outlets as you would publish any other type of research, which makes them a good potential fit with academic careers. Now, we move to teaching cases. Teaching cases are very, very different because in teaching cases, what we are mainly trying to do is we are trying to use the fact that stories tend to communicate very, very well compared with other types of presentation in order to build a better sense of a particular phenomenon. I was wondering why the screen was so blurry. Maybe I should have put my glasses on. All right, so the type of case that we're going to be emphasizing in this particular session is the discussion case. And the discussion case will almost always focus on a decision that has yet to be made. Now think about this. This is like reading a mystery story and discovering that the last chapter has been torn out. That's what we'll be discussing when we discuss the discussion case. We'll be discussing, all right, we've got this context, what decision should we make? As a result, discussion cases are a little bit dissatisfying to read. If you're just going to read them and not discuss them, you come to the end and it's like, well, what happened? But a good discussion case, it doesn't really necessarily matter what happens. What you're really interested in is how do you think about this particular decision? Now, a long discussion case tends to provide a very full context of the decision. One of the things that I've had to do working with case writers in South Africa is say, look, if you want this case to be truly international, you're going to have to tell us something about South Africa, because most students in the US could not locate Africa on a map and are a little weak on the concept of North and South. So as a consequence, if you want them to understand South Africa, you're going to have to include material on that. When you start to include all this context, what happens is the cases tend to get long. The typical case studies that I use with my students might be 12 single-space pages, plus another 10 or 15 pages of exhibits and tables and illustrations. So they represent something that you can't just prepare in an instant. It usually takes a couple of hours to really get into a case study well enough so that you can discuss it. Now, a short case study provides a decision without giving a lot of context. Right now, my colleague, who would normally be a co-presenter on this workshop, actually went down to South Africa. He's working with the same faculty that I was working with there, but he also is doing an externship this semester. And an externship is essentially a program where we take one of our faculty members and embed them in a local organization. And for a period of a semester, they work as if they were an employee of the local organization. And what this organization wanted him to do was to develop a series of case studies for training purposes within this cybersecurity firm. Now, since everyone in the firm knows a lot about the firm, you can make those cases a lot smaller because you don't have to give the background of the firm. You don't have to give a huge amount of background about cybersecurity because they all know that. That makes for a much smaller case, but it would be a case that would be very hard to use in a classroom context because most of our students need that background. Now, when most people talk about a case study, what they're talking about is an example case study. And an example case study is a complete story that we use to illustrate something. In many respects, it's got the same structure as a research case study, but it doesn't involve all that theory. So when you start telling a story about an organization in your class or about something that's happened to you in your class, you're using an example case study to make a concept more concrete. You don't necessarily have to have lots of theory, which is where it differs from a research case study. Now, there are a couple of other types of case studies that we see a lot of, particularly in the sciences. A walkthrough case study is a case study where we basically have a word problem, usually in a series of steps, and we expect an instructor or a knowledgeable individual to help the participants or the students go through each step in a methodical manner. At Harvard Business School, they taught accounting entirely through discussion cases, which means we weren't given a whole lot of guidance. I think this is one of the reasons so many of my classmates are in jail. Sometimes there is a right answer. Sometimes you want to walk people through the right answer. Because I still remember in the accounting course watching the professor ask some poor hapless student to come to the board and illustrate what they were talking about, and I'd look at it and I'd say, wait a second, they're getting that wrong. You can go to jail for doing what they're doing. And meanwhile, there are 80 other students taking notes on how to do it the wrong way. A general element of my teaching philosophy is that we do not need to teach our students how to do things the wrong way. They come into us with that knowledge. Ideally, it would be better if we could teach them how to do it correctly. And an exercise case provides a rich word problem. It's like a walkthrough case, except you expect the students to do it on their own. So you give them some walkthrough, show them how to do it the right way, and then you give them an exercise case. The sciences in particular use exercise cases a lot. So to review, the emphasis of this workshop, all 3 hours of it, is going to be discussion cases. The benefits of the discussion case: they expose participants to realistic situations. Every discussion case that I work with is based on a real-life situation. Sometimes we will disguise it for the benefits of the participants. We'll change names. Sometimes we'd even change the industry. But it's always based on something we actually observed. Our view is that the world is too complex to imagine that we can make up a story. Most of us are not good enough fiction writers to create realistic case studies, so it's better to model it after what we've actually seen. It encourages higher order learning. When I talk about the case study and learning later in this session, one of the things about case studies is it forces you to absorb information, understand information, synthesize the information, analyze the information, and in many cases create new types of solutions. All of these things basically span the whole gamut of cognitive skills. There are very, very few types of intellectual exercise, I think, that gives you as broad a range of potential cognitive skills as the discussion case. Now, they also provide a structured forum for sharing participant information. Now, what do I mean by that? I have used the same case study in an undergraduate class, a Master's of Information Systems class, an MBA class, and a doctoral class. In fact, I used this case in the doctoral class just last week. What is interesting is that you can have a very, very different type of discussion depending upon the level, but all of the folks involved in the discussion think of it as being valuable. So at the undergraduate level, a lot of the discussion involves just helping them understand the context. They can read the case and they can parrot it back, but they don't really understand the decision. Now you fast forward to our professional doctorate, and shoot, my job is the easiest job in the world. I just toss out a few questions, and the participants all share their own experiences. Everyone in our DBA program has at least a dozen years of senior work experience, and so as a consequence, they've all got interesting reflections, and they can all tie the case study to some of their own experiences. This is why at Harvard, some of the most popular and expensive programs are programs for senior managers, where they're using exactly the same cases that they use in the MBA program. The difference is the discussion becomes more towards sharing experiences as opposed to actually understanding the facts of the case. Typical discussion case in business is open. More than one solution is not only possible, but it's likely. One of the frustrating things I sometimes run into, even in my master's classes, is people are asking me what the right answer is. Well, guess what? With these cases, I have no idea what the right answer is. In some, but not all of the cases, I can tell you what they actually did and whether it was a disaster or not. But does that mean they couldn't have done something better? No. Unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to roll back the clock and try each decision out and see what the outcome is. These are complex systems. Experts in general are really bad at predicting the behavior of complex systems. On the other hand, while there are definitely there's no best answer for a case that we know of, there are lots of approaches that really stink. And you can tell they stink just by reasoning about them. And so what we're trying to do is less push people towards a particular answer than help people think logically to understand where the answers are just totally inconsistent. You know, chances are if you're going to use anchovies as a major component of your dessert, it is going to appeal to a very, very small audience. So we got to get people to understand that sometimes by thinking of things, you can eliminate major mistakes. They're also authentic. They depend upon real-world situations based upon field research. As I say, if it's not authentic, it's fiction. Most of us aren't good enough fiction writers. They tend to be detailed. This is for the long cases. And their focus is a decision that needs to be made. Well, here I am talking about cases and discussion, and what am I doing? I'm lecturing you. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to move on to a little exercise, and we're going to be using a tool called Poll Everywhere. If you have a cell phone or a laptop, you can participate in this, otherwise you can watch. What I am going to do in each case is I am going to give you a brief scenario, and what I want you to do is tell me whether or not you think this is a good fit with a discussion case or whether I need to rethink the scenario. So remember everything we talked about with discussion cases, and we will now move. And these are cybersecurity scenarios that I am putting up here. So our first scenario, an organization that provides network security services is negotiating with a potential customer that seeks 100% protection from hackers. The owner is considering whether to accept the terms, or if not, what alternative terms to propose. Now, what we will now do is I'm going to move you, and I will take you back to the slide originally. If you go to pollev.com/Grandon if you've got a PC, or text Grandon to this, you will be given a choice of 4 options, A, B, C, or D. What I'd like you to do is vote one. This is all anonymous, and as soon as I see one vote, and you can change your vote, I just want to see one vote to make sure that the connection is working, and then we will move back to the question, because I know you'll have to read it. One vote? It's called Poll Everywhere is the name of the app. It's a free app for academics up to 40 students. And it's pollev.com/Grandon will take you to connect to this. I'm just waiting for one vote to show up. Has anyone actually voted? Because I'm not, usually it would show up here. This would be disappointing. There we go, we've got a vote. All right, so we'll now move back here. And I can move back there if you've forgotten the, so this is the question again. Remember, I better get this right, I'll just come back. Remember that A is very unsuitable all the way to D, very suitable. So if everyone's got the question, I'll move back here so that you can see the alternatives. So I know we've had at least 4 votes. We'll wait for a little bit longer. All right, well, I don't want to take too long because I don't want to run out of time. Okay, now we've got up to 5, 6, All right. Well, we'll keep doing this multiple times, so I don't want to take too long on any one. What is the first thing I said about a discussion case? What is the most critical thing that defines a discussion case? Well, that's which type of case, but what is it that makes a discussion case? Where does a discussion case end? A decision that needs to be made. Now, if we move back up here, is there a decision that needs to be made? Yes. Yep. In fact, this was one of the first cases we did. Because the decision is, do we accept the terms of the contract? Well, that's not really a decision because you can never guarantee 100%. But deciding what alternate terms to propose, that is an interesting decision because you don't necessarily want to lose the client, but you're going to have to educate the client. This is why I do this exercise, by the way. All right. Malware detection algorithm. A scientist has developed an algorithm that has proven effective in identifying the presence of malware in network traffic. He wants to write a case that describes how the algorithm works and provides descriptive examples of its effectiveness. Okay. I'll just bring us down here. As soon as I get a vote, we'll go back to the question. And again, you can change your vote. I always like to make sure that this thing's working, okay? All right. Najib, you know, you're keeping Risa from voting, apparently. No. By the way, when you think your students understand what you're saying as they nod and you're speaking, this is what happens when you actually test it. So, right now, the unsuitable seem to have it. Why was the decision unsuitable here? What is it about this that would make you think it's not as suitable as written for a case study? There's no decision to be made, right. Now, we did in fact create a case on this, but the actual decision was, what do I do with this? Because his interest was actually in studying the effect of music on the brain. He had really very little interest in cybersecurity. He had just demonstrated this algorithm worked really well on a test data set. And so the question is, well, how do I proceed? And that was an interesting question. You know, what do you do when you think you've got a solution in the early stage, but you're not interested in putting that much time into it? So it can lead to a very interesting discussion, but not as presented there. Next scenario, authentication requirements. Customers of an organization that provides e-commerce hosting have requested that it implement some form of multi-factor authentication, which is a type of identity protection going beyond a simple password. It needs to determine the best approach to dealing with the request. We'll wait for a vote and then go back. Okay. By the way, many people have encouraged me to see what the difference in responses is when you can actually see the responses coming in versus not see them coming in, because that's an interesting question. Yes? Could you show us the URL one more time? Of course. Yep. It's always going to be the same one. Can we go back to the slide? Yes, of course. My concern here is, where's the decision? Well, then, if you don't think there's a decision, then what would your response be? And we'll talk about each one of these things. So. Okay, so we seem to have It's interesting. Now we got like a barbell curve, 50-50. So let's go up here and ask the question, is there a decision? It needs to determine the best approach to dealing with the request. That suggests that there are multiple approaches possible, and you have to decide between the approach, or you have to decide on your own approach. In fact, there are like a dozen different ways of implementing multi-factor authentication, but there was also the concern, this particular company, because this is one of our cases, this particular company had a lot of its clients. It basically created marketing hosting systems and logistics hosting systems for small business. A lot of its clients were in places like Africa, where it could be very, very difficult to implement a second factor. So the question is, how do you deal with places like that in the event, because you don't want to wreck your business, but on the other hand, you want to make it secure. Notice we're moving rapidly towards very suitable now. Secure code architecture. A researcher has developed a patented microprocessor architecture that dramatically reduces vulnerability to insecure coding errors. He is considering alternative approaches to getting further research funded, or alternatively to interest a chip company in purchasing the patent. He is also concerned about his university's recent assertion of claims to the patent. Okay. All right, so the consensus here seems to be on very suitable. Why is this suitable? What single word tells you that there's a decision that needs to be made here? Considering. As soon as you're considering something, chances are you're making a decision. What I did is I added this last sentence here, which is true. I actually heard about this at a cybersecurity conference. We never actually developed a case on this. But this is a piece of context that is likely to be very important for the discussion, but it's not the decision. The decision is right here, considering alternative approaches. Intrusion lessons learned. A major bank has just had over 1 million customer records stolen by hackers that appear to be agents of a foreign government. The IT director wants to write a case study describing the events leading up to the incident and how they might be avoided in the future. Okay, let's see where we are now. Well, I got 9 responses. Oh, 10. All right, so the consensus here seems to be very unsuitable. Why is it that you think this might be very unsuitable as written? Someone? Well, I know that at least 6 of you said it. Why would this be unsuitable? He wants a history lesson. There's no real decision. Exactly right. Now, how could we make this suitable? Say we've seen this. How could we build a decision into this?
We'll change that second sentence. Instead of being so narrowly focused on describing events that led up to it and how to avoid it in the future, open it up to the audience, here's what happened, what are some strategies, what are some decisions we could make, how to handle this in the future?
Okay, so what you're saying is here, basically, okay, so now there are going to be a bunch of alternative ways we might consider to avoid this in the future. That's a decision. The other thing you could do is roll back the clock. You could stop it right there. You've just discovered you've been hacked by agents of a foreign government. Now what do we do? There's a whole bunch of decisions that need to be made there. The way it's written, it would be an example case. This is the type of case study that you often see on company websites. This is a case of how our technology solved the customer's problem. Well, that could be a powerful example, and it's good for marketing purposes, but it's hard to discuss because then basically you're saying, oh yeah, you did a good job. Or else, no, we think the person's lying. Yeah.
To introduce a lesson to brand new cybersecurity students, to teach about lessons learned if we're not so familiar, to use it maybe as the basis to do that write-up and have people review it and then move on to the discussion case studies where at least we've got a little context.
Well, as written, this could be a nice walkthrough case where, in other words, you have a whole bunch of cases stacked on top of each other. So you stop it at one point and say, what do we do now? Then you give them another case which says, okay, here's what we did initially. What do you do now? And at Harvard, they often have cases where you have an A, B, C, D case. Usually, the later cases are much smaller, so you can hand them out in class because they've already got the context of the decision. So you just give them a small chunk of what happened next. And that can be a very useful tool for a walkthrough type of process, which is kind of a hybrid of a walkthrough and a discussion. Yes?
Gill, I look at it slightly different. I look at the decision is to document the case as a learning experience. The fact that every time we're going to have a problem, we document it, that's a decision in its own right.
Yeah.
That's why I look at it as a favorable, that it's a culture in the organization that whatever intrusion we're going to have, let's document it to learn from it.
Yeah. And you see, that is actually, I did a bunch of work with the United Nations Staff College, and they were specifically interested in using case studies as a way of capturing past information. And the decision as to whether or not to use case studies as a means of doing this was in fact an interesting decision. I didn't write a case on it, but that's something they're still debating within the United Nations, because what happens is they have this huge amount of experience, but it's never captured in a way that is digestible by others in the organization, and it doesn't get incorporated into their training programs. Yes, there are lots of ways that we can do this type of thing and turn them into discussion cases. And this is one of the reasons why we often get such an interesting spread. IT security audit checklist. An accounting firm has developed a security audit checklist that has proven very effective in identifying system weaknesses before actual intrusions occur. It seeks to develop a case study to describe the audit process and provide examples of its past effectiveness. All right, let's see where we are. So we're getting a pretty significant consensus that this might be unsuitable as it currently stands. Why might you think that it was unsuitable? It would be the basis of a walkthrough or an example. Now, how might we turn this into a discussion case? Pardon? Whether you want to implement the checklist, or perhaps you've got this checklist and now you move into another organization and there are things about the checklist that don't fit, because it was developed in one context. So now you have to figure out, okay, how do we adapt the checklist? Or maybe another checklist comes out and now you have to decide whether you want to use this one or some other checklist. The point is, you always have decisions along the way, and a lot of times in your case study, you have to provide a significant amount of history in order to provide the context for the decision. So this might very well be part of the case study. It simply stops too early. What you need to do is you need to build the decision in. Incident escalation. After receiving a report from the FBI that a seemingly minor penetration has occurred in its systems, a national retailer discovers evidence that the system compromise is far more serious than initially suspected. An academic researcher who happens to be consulting on another project wants to develop a case study to document management's response to the incident as it unfolds. Okay, let's see where we are. So this we've got a pretty significant spread here. All right, so we got, literally it's almost 50-50 on this one, and I can understand exactly why. For those who thought it was not suitable, what is it about this description that doesn't seem suitable? What is the author, how does the author want to write this up? He wants to document management's response. Well, that's not normally a discussion case. On the other hand, up to this point, if we stop here, we've got a beautiful discussion case. What action should we take? So, you know, mind you, to be really hard to get a company to allow you to write a discussion case at that particular point in time. A good rule in terms of getting approval from companies is it's very hard to get approval for companies when you are describing a problem. So a lot of times we as academics come in and say, do you have a problem that we can write a case about? Wrong approach, because companies don't look at problems as an opportunity for problem solving the way academics are. Companies look at problems as something that you don't want to appear in the Wall Street Journal. So as a consequence, what you always want to do is you want to emphasize a decision that needs to be made, not a problem that needs to be solved. It is a vocabulary difference that can cause a lot of tension between academics and folks in practice. We really did even that one out, and I can understand that. Cybersecurity employment opportunities. A large organization in the healthcare industry is growing increasingly frustrated by the small number of women working in its HIPAA security group. It seeks to design and develop a training program that will attract women to its well-paying cybersecurity jobs. Okay, this one is this one's all over the map too. We seem to have a slight edge on well, actually, if we use numeric values, it'd probably just about match. But for someone who thinks it's suitable, what is the reason that it seems to be suitable?
They're looking for a program that will address what they perceive to be a need.
Okay, good. And in fact, design is the key word here. Now, what I would suggest is that if you're going to have a case that requires your participants to design something that is much more challenging than choosing between a set of alternatives. So most of the time when I'm developing a case, particularly if I think it's going to be used at the master's or undergraduate level, I always try to give a series of alternatives. On the other hand, if I were developing a case specifically for my Doctor of Business Administration program, I would be perfectly happy to leave it open-ended and then let them bring in their experience for possible designs, because designing tends to be harder. It also tends to be harder to facilitate a design case, because what happens is that you get alternatives all over the place and you're trying to sketch them up on the board, and it becomes a little bit more challenging, but it can be a very, very rich discussion. It is a type of decision, it's just one that probably requires a more sophisticated group of participants.
I disagree. I think you let the students do the work. You put up those big giant stickers around the room, and you say, have at it.
Yeah.
So you're not running around the room doing the crazy stuff. You let the students pair up 2 or 3.
I mean, you have your own plan. I mean, I'm a psychologist, so we do a lot about implicit biases. How would you know yours is really correct one?
Well, first off, I would say that I virtually never assume that I am correct. I can simply sometimes identify things that clearly wouldn't work. And you know, nobody's perfect. I will, however, relate an experience I had. One of the courses that I had the most fun, probably the most fun course that I ever had during my MBA program, was a course that I was forced into because all the good courses were oversubscribed. So I end up in a course on cost accounting. You know, cost accounting by the case method, I mean, talk about a deadly situation. So the first day of the class, you know, we're analyzing the case. I raise my hand and I make a point. This fellow 3 seats down from me raises his hand and disagrees with me, the bastard. So the next class, he made a point. I immediately disagreed with him. Every single class, when he said anything, I would disagree with him. When I said anything, he would disagree with me. The funny thing about it was we actually agreed on almost everything. So both our hands would shoot up because the first person got to make the good point. The second person had to make the really sucky point. He later became the CEO of Foot Locker. But I still remember the last class. I got my hand up first. I made my point. He raised his hand. He agreed with me. I raised my hand, retracted my point, and disagreed with myself. And as an instructor, one of the things that I do to avoid consensus from developing, because consensus is the death of a good discussion, is I will often argue points that are completely inconsistent with my own views in order to get someone to challenge me. And very quickly, students learn the best way to get my enthusiasm is to cut me off at the legs, to point out that my arguments are totally specious and that you know, they've got a better way of doing it. And for those of you who have taken my course, those of you in the in the DBA class, what is the first case study I discuss? No, that's the second one. The first one is the EMBA, where an entire class of mine goes into open rebellion. This is a case study as I was writing about a class that went into open rebellion. And one of the reasons for doing that is to get them comfortable with the notion that I like to be challenged. However, I fully admit that I cannot necessarily control my own biases, but what I can do is sometimes operate against my own perceptions as a way of building discussions. Because my job as the facilitator is not to judge right or wrong, it's to help the students reason about the situation. And I do an assessment at the end of each case. My students in the master's and undergraduate programs have to fill in a reflection that always has the same two questions. What are the three most important things you learned from the case? And the second one is, how did the discussion of the case change your mind? And one of the interesting things about it is often I will give top marks to people who come up with entirely different conclusions if they can explain to me how they reasoned about them. But, yeah. Yes, of course. So what they did is they brought in case studies about a somewhat similar situation in Indonesia. You know, guess what? We were happy to make criticisms about the Indonesians, you know, and it allowed people to take positions that would not necessarily be consistent with the positions they take within their own company as a way, within their own country, as a way of helping to develop understanding. Okay, just a couple more scenarios. Security budgeting. A medium-sized manufacturing business is attempting to determine what is an appropriate amount to spend on cybersecurity and where that money should be allocated. It has a series of third-party proposals on the table and has also acquired some benchmarking data on industry norms for security spending. Well, either we got one vote or we have a strong consensus, and I'm voting for consensus because, oh yeah, we do have all sorts of things. Now, you may not have any interest in budgeting, but do not distinguish, be sure to distinguish the fact that you're not interested in the topic from whether or not it would make a good discussion case study, because no matter how boring the topic might be to you, there is always someone for whom it is a passion. All right, last one. During the course of the migration, it discovered many unsuspected vulnerabilities in its systems that it suspects may be present in other divisions that still host their own IT. It wants to develop a case to document these vulnerabilities and present the implementation approach that it pursued. Okay, we have a pretty strong consensus, at least. Yeah, there's basically the decision point is here. This is the decision they've already made. They want to write cases and distribute them. There are lots of other ways they could have dealt with the problem. So if we'd stopped it there, then we'd have an interesting decision what to do next. As soon as we say, okay, we're going to create a case and we're distribute out to the other parts of the organization, that's no decision. Now you could say, well, how are we going to distribute it? How are we going to make them read it? Now, there would be decisions associated with that. I've run a little bit late, though actually not that much late considering we started a little late. If there are any questions, I would do here is just briefly go over case writing. When I do a full case writing workshop, it can take up to 4 days. So obviously we're a little bit more abbreviated here. Let's see, where's the cheat sheet? There it is. So, plenary sessions, I'll be talking about getting students to write materials for your courses. And one of the things that my colleague Matt Malarkey and I have done is put a lot of time into trying to create materials that will allow students, particularly our executive students and our MBA students, to develop case studies that we can later use in our classes. And so some of the materials I'm presenting here are materials that we developed in that particular context, because I have been extremely impressed by the ability of students to develop interesting case studies, but it does take a considerable amount of work. Interestingly, as part of my Fulbright, while I was at the University of Cape Town, I worked on the development of 4 case studies with undergraduates, and they're all very good case studies, and we've published all of them. It's a lot of work, but it's very satisfying. So what I handed out is this case design cheat sheet. It is also on the Canvas site. And what we do is we use a very formulaic approach to developing a case study. It's possible to develop case studies using other structures, but this structure probably represents 80 or 90% of the discussion cases out there. And by formalizing it, it makes it a little bit easier for both students and faculty writing their first case to deal with the blank page syndrome. So the first page of a case basically substitutes for the executive summary or the abstract of a paper, and what it does is it tells the story as concisely as possible without giving you all the context. So typically, the first graph identifies who's the decision maker. One of the big mistakes I often see people writing case studies do is they try to write a case without a decision maker. Organizations don't make decisions, people do. So what you want to try to do is you want to try to find a decision maker. Now sometimes the decision maker can only make a recommendation, but what to recommend is also a decision. So the point is, if you don't know anything about the decision maker, it's very hard to determine what decision he or she is going to make or make a recommendation. Then you briefly summarize the context. What organization is this decision being made in? What is the industry? If there's a business unit, what's the business unit? If it's a technology-related decision, you might need a sentence or two on the technologies associated with it. But remember, it all has to fit on that first page. We will send back any case where it flows over into the second page and say, get it down to one page. Then, in broad technical terms, non-technical terms, you say, okay, well, what is the nature of the decision? Now, one of the nice things about this is I can tell by reading the very first page of a case if they've written a discussion case or if they're trying to write some other type of case. Because if it doesn't have a decision here, then I bounce it right back. Finally, if alternatives are being considered, if it isn't a pure design case, what alternatives are being considered? And if they're not considering specific alternatives, sometimes you can bracket it. Say, well, on one extreme there's do nothing, and on this other extreme there's, basically get out of business and start herding goats in Montana. And what that does is it gives you a lot of range, and that's sort of a signal that maybe it's going to be up to the reader or the discussant to come up with suitable alternatives that are somewhere in the middle. Then what we recommend is that a case body be developed that basically moves from the most general aspects to the more specific aspects of the decision. So if we've got a technology that's going to be new to our typical participants, we might have a section on the technology. So for example, when I wrote the multi-factor authentication case, I had to have several pages dealing with why multi-factor authentication, what are some of the different ways you can do multi-factor authentication, all written in a completely neutral tone. Basically, the idea is you want to create it so that the different alternatives all seem viable. If a decision has already been made, if it's obvious, then it's probably not going to be a good discussion case because, well, the decision's obvious. So there has to be a reason, and that's one of the reasons you go into the organization to talk to them. If the manager is having a tough time making the decision, guess what? It's probably a good decision because your students, if they're having an easy time, it means they don't understand the problem. Sometimes you got to describe the country or region. As I said, if I want to use a case on South Africa, I need to explain what South Africa is if it's going to be used in the U.S. We had a wonderful case in Vietnam that required a lot of discussion of the Vietnamese culture and, in fact, Confucianism, because the question that the decision maker was raising is whether or not he should accept a promotion. And in the US, that would be considered a complete non-decision. Of course, you're offered a promotion, of course you take it. We believe in the Peter principle. Just keep promoting me until I'm not any good at my job, and then I'll stop. But he had the decision maker had a very, very different perspective and was concerned about what would happen to his family if he failed. Was it too early in his career to be promoted? All of these things, and you really had to spend a lot of time talking about the philosophy of it in order to understand why it was such a challenge. Another one of the Vietnamese cases dealt with package delivery, and that provided a tremendous amount of, you needed a lot of context to understand what a tremendous fear of counterfeiting they had and how critical it was that you trusted the retailer. Here in the US, maybe we don't worry about that as much. Well, I don't worry about it because, of course, I get all my clothes from JCPenney, so I'm not worried about whether my style is going to be compromised. But for the most part, we expect to get what we order, whereas in Vietnam, they don't feel that way about things at all. So these are all types of contexts where if I were to explain that to a student in Vietnam, he would be looking at me and say, "Duh, well, that's obvious." But to my participants in the US, it wasn't obvious at all. You need to probably describe the industry, maybe the environment, the regulatory environment. In South Africa, for example, very often race will play a very important part in understanding the case discussion because of their history. I mean, apartheid only ended there in the early 1990s. It is still a very, very raw nerve, and so it's something that you need to explain.
Just following the comment of country and region description, I'm just, it's not necessarily just to give the main reader or the audiences an idea about the country. There are some factors also affecting making a decision.
Oh.
Like you mentioned something about Vietnam and others. Like you can talk about culture, you can talk about values, you can talk about religion. My colleague here mentioned something about bias. All these factors actually have affecting the decision.
Tremendous impact.
I'm not just give information about the country, all these things, because by the end you have to put your decision based on the context of the study.
Absolutely, and in fact, a really good example of that is one of the South African cases that I edited. Basically involved an insurance company and their decisions regarding burial insurance, funeral insurance. And now to someone in the US, funeral insurance, well, why would I want funeral insurance? I'll be dead. It's not my problem. Well, it turns out in South Africa, they have a very, very different cultural attitude towards death. And in fact, they view it as moving on to a better place. It is a time of celebration, and you can really bring shame upon your family if you do not have a sufficiently impressive going away party, to which, by the way, everyone in the world is invited. So you can't control the visitor list. Anybody who wants to come can come. And as a result, if, say, a cousin dies, you're expected to help pay for the funeral so it doesn't bankrupt his or her family. Well, if I experienced a culture like that, yes, I damn well want to have insurance, because basically you're not only insuring yourself you're not only insuring your family, but you're also, in a sense, insuring yourself against the demands of other members of your family. And so in the US, we don't really have a culture like that, so you can't understand it. So the cultural elements are very, very important. The regulatory elements are very important. In the US, I can pretty much get away with saying anything. I got to be a little careful if I'm talking about things in a place like Vietnam. My old instructor, Warren McFarland, always said, when he's considered one of HBS's biggest China experts, he always says, well, the in China, the thing that you have to pay the most attention to is the individual in the back of the room who's writing notes, because that's the representative of the party. And in many respects, he or she would be the most powerful individual in the room. In the US, you know, I don't care if a damn Democrat or damn Republican is sitting in the back. That doesn't make any difference to us. But it's a very, very different situation there. So these, what you're describing, and folks in the US don't understand any of that, whereas to folks in the culture, it would seem completely obvious. And that's why the cases tend to get long. Yeah.
You talk about decision makers at the beginning. In reality, in a lot of organizations, the person making the decision doesn't have the final say. Usually there are key recommenders, there are influencers, which you don't put in the case at the beginning, but you put in the context of the case. And student would need to pick up that this person, although he's the manager making the decision, but there is a lot of other factors that influence that decision.
Absolutely, and in fact, one of the things I frequently point out in cases is a lot of times what you're really dealing with is a recommendation. So it may very well be that there is some government level committee that will make the final decision, even though you're the manager, but your job is to recommend. And in that case, it's not only the recommendation, but it's how you go about making the recommendation that's going to be so critical. Because if you make the recommendation the wrong way, you'll piss off the folks, and they'll go exactly the opposite of the way you want to do it. And all of these things are really important for students in every country to understand, because if you don't understand what you don't understand about a culture, you're going to go in and constantly blunder around thinking people behave in the same way that you do. So after that, you move down to the next level, which is typically the organization in which the context is being made, and then you move down to the decision itself. And then finally, you have a kind of a wrap-up where you might summarize some of the decision makers' thoughts about the decision. Then you'll have a series of exhibits that need to be sort of referenced in the text, so that you might have a map of the country, you might have an income statement for the organization if it's a company, you might have documents such as statements of the organization's vision taken from their website. All of the exhibits have to be referenced so that we know where they came from. And sometimes, as a case writer, you will end up organizing material in a particular way to help communicate it to students. But one of the things that does is when you actually deal with the organization, by writing a case on the decision that they're making, you often provide them with an external view that gives them a totally different perception of the decision. When we first developed a series of cases for our undergraduate capstone course as part of a National Science Foundation grant, the first time we administered the course, we had 11 new cases. We had the actual decision maker involved in 10 of those cases. In 6 of the cases, they hadn't made the decision yet. We were running a little behind in getting the cases out, and so some of these cases were written like 3 weeks before we used them. And in at least 3 of the cases, the decision maker said listening to the undergraduate's discussion actually changed the decision that they were leaning towards. So as a case writer, you can actually have a significant impact on a decision. In our Doctor of Business Administration program, the first publication course we have, that is a course where they're supposed to write a paper which could be submitted for publication, we have them write a discussion case, because that forces a kind of reflection on a decision that they are making. We call them a selfie case if you're writing about your own decision. It forces them to reflect about it in a much more systematic way and to try to pull in evidence that would be useful for the decision makers, that would be useful for the students discussing it, but also turn out to be quite useful for the decision maker. So that's the cheat sheet that we give out. Now, what I'd like to do is just briefly go over what is available on the Canvas site that we'll be giving you. So, well, that's on that link. First off, and in this book, what I've also done is, I think for the first 7 chapters, let's see, maybe I didn't click that hard enough. For the first 7 chapters, we also have about 15 or 20 minute long videos that summarize the chapters. So you can actually watch the videos, read the chapters. These are principally the chapters about the case writing process, and the videos kind of follow the chapters, and it goes up through the writing of a discussion case. And as I say, the book is open access. It's published under a Creative Commons 4.0 BYNC, which basically means you can give it to anybody. We got no problem. Just, if you get something useful from it and you write papers that refer to it, just, cite us. We like to be cited. The types of cases, that's actually the slides that we just went over. The case cheat sheet, I just handed that out. Now the case studies writing checklist is basically a checklist of things to think about when you're writing a case. And I think I've got about 2 hours worth of videos explaining some of the different stages of case writing. This is how I can really turn this workshop into a 2 or 3 day workshop if I actually do these lectures, but you can get them all here, and they also closely parallel the book. Then, let's see, we move on down. The courses, the ones that I'll do right after lunch, case method and learning, case facilitation. We're going to do this pretty quickly. That will be a really rapid fire. And then we've got some supporting materials. Here are the cybersecurity cases. I'll talk about this at the very end. One of the things I did is we administered the first cybersecurity case course this past fall, and we organized the cases that we used in that according to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And all but one of these cases are here. The one case hasn't been released yet, but we're going to get that released shortly. So here are the cases that we've written. We have some supporting materials. These are articles that I've written with colleagues on our results at trying to assess the learning associated with the use of discussion cases. As I'll talk about with discussion cases, the principal goal of a discussion case is to help the individual develop their judgment. Well, judgment is really hard to measure. And so probably the most unsatisfying things about case studies in the classroom is that the students are reacting positively. You're hearing a good discussion, but you can't measure it. You can't figure out how much they've learned, and Lord knows we've tried. So I use a lot of different techniques, which I talk about in the book, to try to make sure that I am seeing evidence of learning. But in terms of hard numbers, there's no multiple choice test that I've been able to devise that actually shows me, well, when they came into the course, they knew this. When they came out of the course, they knew that. We actually tried this as part of the grant. And the first time we ran the course, we saw statistically significant increases in certain learning dimensions. We were so excited. We replicated it. The next time we replicated it, we showed no significant increases. The next time we replicated it, we showed no significant increase, except we saw a decrease in one area that was statistically significant, which means that we actually sucked knowledge out of their head over the course of the semester. It's really hard. Now, and we don't believe that we actually did that. Professor, do no harm. But the fact is it's very difficult, and in a world of metrics it can be very challenging, especially to convince faculty who are often suspicious of this type of learning that there actually is learning. Yes?
I want to raise the issue that you're saying we write 20, 30 pages for the case study.
Yep.
This is fine for somebody whose native language is English. let's move to the scenario where English is the second or third language. Reading in a class a case of 20, 30 page is a nightmare. My concern here is if this case study would be developed in a video environment, a video is much more in communication, it's much easier for people second and third language, and you'll find that their interaction with the video where they could watch it multiple times and grasp what's going on far better than reading and reading and reading.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, I actually have a proposal into the National Science Foundation to develop a platform for the delivery of multimedia case studies, which include both videos and textual materials that are guided by an expert system. I won't hear about that one until probably late April as to whether or not we're going to be able to move forward on it. I agree with you. Now, one question I would ask is, are the classes that you're dealing with routinely being held in English?
Yes, but the English is adjusted to the level of the students.
Well, and that's what I would say is then if you're writing a case study in that context, that you want to try to adjust it. Now, understand the case studies we write, we try to write it in much more plain language than we would for an academic paper, and we don't have all that theory. But I mean, I agree with you. The problem is there are some things that are going to be very hard to analyze from a video. For example, if you're dealing with a case that requires financial analysis, you're probably going to be much more comfortable working with a spreadsheet or a table of numbers than you would a video. We actually, my colleague Matt Malarkey is now requiring each of his students, when they develop cases as a team, which is something I'll actually talk about in tomorrow's session, but when they develop cases in a team, he actually is requiring them to get a video of the decision maker talking about 15 minutes or so about the decision being made. We think that it would be an absolutely great resource. So the answer is, I think there is potential value to having having multimedia materials. In fact, I'm very excited about the possibility of developing multimedia case studies. But I would say that if, for example, we're training people in business and they're challenged by English, then then one of the best ways of addressing that challenge is actually requiring them to read longer and complex documents, because nobody's going to shave down their annual report in order to make it more accessible outside of the US. And frankly, academics in general have a terrible challenge when all the ranked journals are in English and English is not their native language. It's incredibly unfair to folks outside the US. And I'm not exactly sure how to address that situation. But I do agree with you that if we can find media that allow you to capture the same richness of context using things like videos, then obviously that's an advantage.
Even the videos should be structured based on the structure of the case that you gave.
Yep.
Section 1, Section 2. What we will do, make Section 1 a short video, Section 2 a short video, and the documentation is associated with the video rather than being a long document. Yeah. Okay, watch this video. This is the 4 or 5 pages related to that. By breaking it into components, you have a much better way to...
Interestingly enough, that's exactly what those videos in the book do. They go in each chapter and they're short 15, 20-minute videos capturing the high point of the chapter and then refer people to the chapter itself.
It's the same concept in developing the case.
Yeah, and there it's just, again, it's just potentially part of the problem is also logistical. Now, it used to be that it was really hard to create videos. Now it's become a lot easier. Because everyone has a full-fledged video studio in their pocket. We call it a cell phone. All right, well, I just realized that I'm almost completely, well, actually, I'm 3 minutes past time, but we'll ignore that. The last thing I want to talk about is we have a journal that publishes cases open access. It launched a couple of years ago. We're publishing about 15, 20 cases a year. All the cybersecurity cases are there, and we have extensive information for authors who want to submit with lots of videos. And then the other thing is that, and again, these are all linked here. We have a template on writing case studies that basically walks you through the process of creating a case. That video is rather long, unfortunately, but it basically takes you through all the stages, and we've got templates. So for those of you who are interested in following up in the area of case writing, there are lots of resources here, and also feel free to avail yourselves of me as a resource, so that because I'm always happy to chat with people who are trying to write cases. And I've ended up doing case workshops all over the world to help work with universities that are serious about introducing case writing into their curriculum. With that, why don't we take a break for lunch?